When he walked into the courtroom, everyone understood instantly. This young man was not used to hearing the word no. It was an ordinary morning in the Providence Municipal Court, the kind where routine cases drift by like slow traffic. Parking violations, rolling stops, noise complaints, nothing dramatic. The camera lights hummed softly. The clerk read names with practiced calm. Judge Caprio had settled into a steady rhythm, his voice gentle, his focus unwavering. Then the door swung open with a sharp, metallic click. A subtle shift rippled across the room. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the air seemed to tighten. Austin Clark, 27, son of one of the city's most influential businessmen, crossed the aisle as if the floor belonged to him. No glance at the clerk, no nod to the judge, no acknowledgement of the people sitting quietly in line. He kept speaking into his phone, ignoring the clerk's reminder to silence devices. He didn't lower his voice, he didn't break stride. He simply existed as though the rules were ornamental. A sheet of paper, his summons, slid from his fingers onto the clerk's desk, not handed, but dropped. He didn't bother looking at her, didn't notice the slight tightening around her mouth. Several people in the audience shifted. A faint murmur rose. Someone whispered, "Oh," one of them again. Judge Caprio followed the sound with his eyes. The calm in his expression cooled by a degree, not anger, but awareness. Something was about to unfold. Austin took his place at the podium with an impatient sigh and muttered, loud enough for the microphone to catch it, "Let's get this over with. I don't have time for this circus." The room stiffened, not because of the words — plenty of people said foolish things in frustration — but because of how he said them. As if the court, the process, the law were all beneath him. As if he were indulging them by simply showing up. In the third row, an older man straightened in his seat. His jaw clenched, a tendon along his neck stood out. He recognized the young man instantly. The name, the face, the last name that carried weight in boardrooms and back rooms across the city. This older man had once worked for Austin's father, and he had left that company with fewer illusions than when he'd entered it. The judge lifted a hand, halting the clerk mid-sentence, a rare interruption that drew immediate silence from every corner of the room. "Young man," Caprio said, voice steady but edged with steel, "would you like to start this hearing again?" Austin raised his eyes for the first time, a mixture of defiance and entitlement flickering within them. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The tension answered for him. The atmosphere sharpened, humming with that electric certainty that something larger than a parking ticket was about to break loose. Because everyone in the room could feel it. He wasn't just a rude young man. He was someone who had walked into this court many times before the hearing even began, in the form of privilege, family name, and decades of unspoken exemptions. And today, for the first time, it looked like none of that would help him. The moment held, tight, heavy, expectant, perfect for the storm that was coming next. The clerk resumed reading the case, but the judge's gaze stayed fixed on the young man standing before him, not with irritation, but with a quiet curiosity, as though he were examining a puzzle that had just revealed a missing piece. Austin Clark wasn't an enigma to Providence. People knew the name. They knew the company that dominated the shipping terminals. They knew the father who donated to libraries, funded scholarships, appeared in glossy magazines beside governors and senators. And they knew the son, the one who grew up in private clubs where parking rules were something that happened to other people. On paper, today's infraction was small, 4 separate violations for stopping in clearly marked no stopping anytime zones. Minor fees for most people. But the timestamps caught the judge's eye, all clustered around early morning hours near a luxury fitness club that served the city's elite. "Mr. Clark," Caprio said calmly, "am I correct that these violations occurred on days you were at the Windsor Athletic Center?" Austin barely nodded. It's the only place nearby to park. Everyone uses that lane." A few people in the audience let out soft, incredulous breaths. It was the kind of argument that instantly revealed the bubble he lived in. Judge Caprio leaned back slightly, studying him. Not judging him, studying him. Because the arrogance in Austin's voice wasn't theatrical. It wasn't for show. It was the kind of reflex that forms when a child grows up hearing doors open before they even touch the handle. The older man in the third row murmured under his breath, "Some things don't change." His tone wasn't bitter, just tired, like someone who'd seen too much of this family's pattern. A woman beside him whispered, "Kids like that never face anything real." The judge lifted a hand gently without even looking at her. A subtle reminder that he wouldn't allow the room to turn into a chorus. He flipped through the case file and paused at a photograph, a car angled across a sidewalk, blocking the ramp meant for wheelchair access. The image was projected on the screen behind him. The room reacted instantly, not loudly, but with a shared wince. That kind of carelessness cut deeper than a fine. It revealed something about a person's blind spots. Austin's jaw tightened. His fingers tapped the podium, quick, sharp movements betraying more nerves than he intended to show. "There's something else of interest here," the judge continued. "Your previous citation, the one dismissed before the hearing. Do you recall that?" A shadow crossed Austin's expression. "It was handled." "Handled," Caprio repeated softly, as if tasting the word. "Yes, I'm aware." He didn't elaborate, but the implication hung heavily in the air. The court knew exactly what handled meant in Providence. Someone had stepped in, someone had paid, someone had smoothed the ripples before they reached the shore. But today felt different. The judge shifted to a new page. "One more question, Mr. Clark. Does your father know you're here this morning?" The reaction was immediate, too immediate. "That's irrelevant," Austin snapped. And for the first time, the mask slipped. Not in anger, but in defense. A flash of something raw, something unsettled. The judge caught it instantly. The people in the room felt it too. There was trouble behind the polished facade of the Clark family. A tension deeper than parking tickets, deeper than privilege. Something had cracked long before this morning. Austin stared ahead, shoulders stiff, refusing to show how that single question had struck him harder than any accusation. The judge closed the file, his tone steady as ever, but his eyes sharper now, as though he recognized that this case was no longer about paint on a curb. It was about a young man standing on ground that had been slipping beneath him for years. And the room sensed it. The real confrontation was only beginning. Judge Caprio opened the folder again, but this time he didn't look at the documents. He looked directly at Austin, long enough for the room to sense a shift. Whatever patience had framed the morning was giving way to something firmer. "Mr. Clark," he began, "let's address the first violation. Who was driving your vehicle at 8:42 a.m. on March 3rd? Austin answered without hesitation. "I was." He said it smoothly, confidently, the kind of answer meant to close a door, not open one. Caprio didn't blink. "Interesting," he replied, "because the traffic camera shows the driver wearing a dark jacket. You were wearing a light one in every other photo from that morning." A ripple of silence traveled across the courtroom, the kind that tightens backs and widens eyes. For the first time all day, color drained from Austin's face. The judge's voice remained calm, almost gentle. "You understand that statements made here carry legal weight." A subtle reminder. But to this audience, many of them older, many of them raised on strict notions of civic duty, it rang like a bell. Lying in a courtroom was not just a mistake. It was a breach of something sacred. Austin swallowed. His fingers curled against the podium. In the third row, the older man who had recognized him earlier shifted forward. His hands rested on the top of his cane, knuckles white. Then, speaking in a steady, low voice, he said, "That wasn't him driving." Gasps stirred the room. Judge Caprio turned slightly toward the man, not startled but attentive. He had allowed spontaneous witness clarifications before, and this moment demanded it. "You're stating for the record," the judge asked, "that Mr. Clark was not the driver?" "I am," the older man replied. "I saw that car every morning for months. I know who was behind the wheel." A new hush settled. Not the same silence as before. This one carried weight, history, resentment, truth. Austin's posture stiffened. The edge of defiance in him faltered, replaced by something less stable. Judge Caprio resumed. "There is another pattern here. All 4 violations occurred during delivery hours for Clark Logistics. Yet your vehicle was parked where delivery trucks needed access. Were you aware of this?" The words landed with the precision of someone assembling a puzzle piece by piece. Austin's reply was slower than before, locked behind a tightening jaw. "I didn't check the schedule." "That's clear," Caprio said. The room could feel it, the unraveling. The sense that this case had never been about careless parking. It had always been about what those actions represented: entitlement, avoidance, shortcuts taken without thought for consequences. But now, something deeper emerged, a motive hiding beneath arrogance. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Clark, you seem less concerned about the fines than about something else entirely. This presentation of confidence is cracking." A flicker passed through Austin, not anger, not fear, but recognition, as if someone had finally named the thing he'd tried hardest to bury. Caprio lowered his voice just enough for the room to lean in. "You didn't come here today because of tickets. You're here because someone finally told you no, and you don't know what to do with that." The line struck like a gavel. Not loud, not cruel, just true. Austin's shoulders tightened, his breath shallow. His carefully arranged composure slipped one notch further. Around him, the courtroom waited, suspended between what they thought this case was and what it was becoming. And somewhere deep inside that silence, the first real fracture appeared in the armor he'd worn his whole life. The judge motioned for the clerk, who stepped forward with a newly printed document, still warm from the machine. She placed it in front of him quietly, but the room felt the importance of the moment before a single word was spoken. Caprio adjusted his glasses, scanning the page. His brows lifted slightly, not in surprise, but as if a puzzle he'd been assembling had finally revealed its missing corner. "Mr. Clark," he said, tapping the document, "this is not part of your original file. It was just forwarded from the Department of Transportation." A hush swept across the courtroom. Even Austin stopped fidgeting. "This record concerns the registered owner of the car involved in these violations." He paused, letting the weight of the sentence settle. "The car is not registered to you?" Austin blinked. "I know that," he muttered. "It belongs to the company." Caprio raised a finger. "Yes, Clark Logistics." Another measured pause. "But the company has officially reported that you were not authorized to use this vehicle." The room reacted instantly, not loudly, but with that stunned inhale that turns a courtroom into a pressure chamber. Unauthorized use of corporate property. That wasn't a parking matter. That was a legal fault line. Austin's shoulders dropped a fraction, the first sign that he understood the ground beneath him had shifted. Before anyone could speak, the older man in the third row stood, slowly, deliberately. He was not dramatic. He didn't need to be. The years in his posture, the history etched into his face, carried their own authority. "Your Honor," he said, "I should clarify something." Caprio studied him. "State your name for the record." The man complied, his voice steady. Then came the revelation that cracked the case wide open. The person driving that car wasn't him. It was his father. The impact hit like a silent explosion. Someone whispered, No way. Another covered their mouth. Austin didn't move. He stared ahead, expression hollow. The judge folded his hands. You're certain? I worked for Mr. Clark Sr. for 22 years. I know the way he carries himself. I know his habits. And I know that vehicle. He used it often. Caprio shifted his gaze back to Austin. The young man looked like someone standing in a doorway with no exit left behind him. Mr. Clark, the judge said quietly, were you attempting to accept responsibility for violations committed by your father? A muscle jumped along Austin's jaw. For a long moment he didn't speak. And that was answer enough. The room was suspended in the kind of silence that doesn't simply fall. It presses. Caprio continued, voice controlled, not accusatory. You said earlier that your father was busy. Did he ask you to take the blame? No response. Just a shallow breath, a flicker of pain where arrogance had once lived. The judge leaned back, seeing the truth unfold with unexpected clarity. This is no longer about parking, he said softly. This is about a young man carrying the weight of another's choices, likely for the first time in his life. Around them, the courtroom seemed to inhale collectively. Not in judgment, something closer to understanding, and shock at how profoundly the story had turned. Austin finally lowered his gaze, not in defeat, but in the unmistakable recognition that the secret he'd guarded was no longer his to hide. Whatever came next would not just expose the truth, it would redefine it. For a moment, Judge Caprio didn't speak. The courtroom felt suspended in a kind of heavy stillness, as if everyone sensed the next words would determine the meaning of everything revealed so far. When he finally leaned forward, his tone had changed. Not stern, not irritated, something deeper. The voice of a man who had watched decades of human struggle pass through the same wooden doors. Mr. Clark, he said quietly, you walked in here carrying yourself like someone who had already won. He let the truth settle. But what I see now is someone who's been carrying something else entirely. Austin stood motionless, the defiance long gone. His eyes were fixed on the table in front of him, as if reading a sentence only he could see. Caprio continued, you weren't protecting your reputation today. You were shielding a person who didn't even come to stand beside you. That line hit harder than any accusation. Austin's throat tightened. He didn't look up. Then, surprising everyone in the room, even himself, he spoke. It wasn't his idea, he said softly. He didn't ask. I just did it. No dramatics, no excuses. Just the bare truth of a man raised to believe that covering someone else's fault was the price of belonging. In our family, he added, showing weakness is worse than being wrong. A murmur passed through the audience, not of judgment, but of recognition. The kind people feel when they see something painfully human. The judge exhaled. Not loudly, but with the weight of someone who understood exactly what those words meant. Let me tell you something, Caprio said, voice firm but not sharp. Weakness is pretending you have no limits. Weakness is lying to make someone else look stronger. He leaned slightly closer. Real strength is owning your actions, and greater strength still is refusing to carry someone else's missteps. The older man in the third row lowered his gaze, touched by the unexpected justice unfolding before him. The room was silent, not out of tension, but out of respect. Caprio reached for the file again. Given the evidence, the majority of these violations cannot be assigned to you, he said. They will be dismissed. Brisk murmurs of approval swept through the gallery. But, he continued, raising a finger, there is one citation you will carry. Not because of the car, not because of your father, because of accountability. The judge then delivered something no one had predicted. You'll complete community service, specifically with the Meals on Wheels program that serves our elderly residents. 20 hours. A soft wave of nods spread through the room. It was a consequence, yes, but also a chance. Austin breathed out slowly. The arrogance that had walked through the door that morning was gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to humility. Finally, he looked up. "Thank you," he said, simple, calm, real. Judge Caprio gave a single firm nod. "Good," he replied, "because if life had been the one to teach you this lesson, it would have done so much harsher." The words settled into the room like a final chord, resonating deeper than any verdict. And for the first time that morning, Austin Clark looked like someone who might truly change. The gavel had barely touched the block when the tension in the courtroom released like a long-held breath. People began gathering their belongings, murmuring softly, still processing what they had witnessed. Not a scolding, not a downfall, but a shift in a young man who had walked in wearing someone else's armor and walked out carrying his own weight. Austin stepped away from the podium slowly, as if feeling the floor differently beneath his feet. The bravado that had once announced his presence was gone. In its place was a quiet awareness, a heaviness that wasn't defeat, but awakening. Near the exit, the older man, the former employee, stood waiting. He didn't block the doorway. He didn't glare. He simply watched the young man approach, his expression neither soft nor hard, but honest. When Austin reached him, the man spoke in a low, even voice. "You're not your father. Not today." The words weren't warm, but they weren't cold either. They landed with the weight of truth rather than judgment. For a second, Austin didn't know how to react. He'd spent years being compared to his father, praised by those who needed favors, criticized by those who had been stepped over. But this was different. It was the first time someone said he had the capacity to diverge from a path laid out for him long before he understood what paths even were. He nodded once, firm, respectful. No quips, no dismissive smirk, just acknowledgement. Behind them, Judge Caprio rose from his chair. He wasn't leaving yet. He simply stood watching the quiet exchange. There was something in his eyes, not triumph, not satisfaction, but the steady recognition of a moment that mattered more than the paperwork filed that morning. Austin reached for the door, paused, and turned back. His voice when he spoke was soft but clear enough for the room, or perhaps just the judge and to hear. "I'll come back here," he said, "but not for this, not as the person I was." It wasn't a boast. It wasn't a plea. It was a promise. Not to the court, not to his father, but to himself. Judge Caprio tilted his head slightly, almost the beginning of a smile, though subdued. He murmured, half thought, half blessing, "If more people understood the weight of the choices they make, these benches would be empty." The 7 words floated in the air, settling into the grain of the wood, the old walls, the space where thousands had stood before. It was a reflection, not a reprimand, the kind of line that stayed with listeners long after the video ended. As Austin stepped outside, the sunlight hit him with a clarity he hadn't expected. The day hadn't changed, same streets, same sounds, same city. But he had, or at least the first brick in a new foundation had been laid. Behind him, the courtroom fell quiet. No music, no applause, just a short, profound pause, the kind that leaves an echo. And for anyone listening, anyone watching, anyone old enough to know that life offers few clean endings, the feeling was unmistakable. This story hadn't wrapped up. It had only opened.